Welcome, esteemed Victorians, to the third monthly update video for Victoria 3. My name is Sanna and I'm part of the community team for Victoria, and in this video we're going to take a look at some of the topics from the past month's Dev Diaries. First up, national markets.
In Victoria 3, all countries have a national market, which represents the domestic trade within the country. All states which are connected coherently by infrastructure in the country can participate. If you have one state where you produce a lot of grain and another state that produces a lot of tools, the farms can buy the tools from the other state and that state can purchase the grain. In order for a state to participate in the market, it has to be connected to what we call the market capital, which is usually the capital state, but in some cases, like for example New York in the case of the United States, it can be a different state. This also includes overseas. So if you have overseas territories, you require ports and a positive infrastructure score in order to participate in the market. Otherwise, you're isolated, and whatever you're producing and consuming is local to where you are. All goods have a base price of some kind, which really only matters in relation to each other. So for example, a tank does not fetch the same price as a basket of grain at the same kind of supply and demand levels. But the base price is only one minor part of the equation. The rest comes down to supply and demand, local supply and demand, and market supply and demand, which is what we call sell orders and buy orders. Sell orders and buy orders can be thought of as orders on a commodity market. So when a state requires 100 bushels of grain, they will place or attempt to place 100 buy orders for grain from the national market. If they have lower market access, they're not able to place as many. And that is what generates the final price in both local states and on the market. It is possible for buy orders of a good to exceed sell orders of a good in the market. That's what makes the price higher than the base price and can make a good really expensive. There's a limit to how expensive a good can get, though, before it gets into a shortage situation. When demand for a good is so high compared to supply, that a shortage is triggered, it will greatly affect the industries that require that good and in fact cause those gears to grind to a halt if you don't do something about it. So a shortage is something you absolutely have to try to prevent. Having industries that have started relying on goods that are maybe hard to get or volatile can be really difficult for you if you suddenly lose access. Trade doesn't just happen between states in the same market. It's not the case that countries are isolated entities in and of themselves, at least not most of the time. Often there's some kind of trade routes that go from one market to another. And that's represented by the trade route creating buy orders and sell orders in the markets, which also affect the prices in the different markets. So by buying goods from your competitor, you are raising the price of the products that they produce, which might be bad in the long run. Markets do represent domestic trade, but that doesn't mean that a market can only contain one country. In many cases, multiple countries will be a part of the same market, with one country being the market controller. In some cases, that's because there's a mutual pact between the countries called the customs union, where one country is the one where all the external trade flows through, and the other ones are able to participate and benefit from the trade that this market does, and also connect to all the other states in the same customs union. The other case is where a country has subjects, such as a puppet or a dominion or a territory, which is considered to be part of their market, in which case they don't get to have sovereignty over their own trade. They get to participate in their overlord's market. And this is another way that you can increase your economic power and enforce that upon the world, getting the resources that you want and getting the customers that you want for the goods you produce without necessarily conquering.
Maintaining a sustainable national market seems like an interesting challenge for sure. And now, infrastructure.
Infrastructure is something that is, of course, very important to the Victorian era. You know, you have a lot of goods being produced around the world, like clothes or steel, but of course you can't just teleport that goods where you want to have it. If you want to bring steel from the American eastern coast into the American frontier, you need infrastructure. Now, infrastructure can take a whole lot of different forms. It can be a river, natural forms of infrastructure. It can be ships moving along the coast, and it can be other geographic forms of infrastructure. But of course, the big thing about the era is railroads. Each state in Victoria 3 has an infrastructure value and an infrastructure usage value. You can think of the infrastructure as the state's ability to transport goods, and infrastructure usage as the state's need for transportation of goods. So in a more rural state, where you just have a few farms moving a bit of food around, you will not have need for a lot of infrastructure. But if you go heavily into industrialization, if you build chemical plants, arms factories, shipyards that need all of this sort of heavy machinery and bulk goods moving around, the need for infrastructure goes up, and correspondingly, the need for infrastructure in the state goes up. The level of infrastructure usage compared to the actual infrastructure, it's what gives you the state's market access. Now, this is a very important value because it determines how well connected the state is to its market. If you have a state that's heavily industrialized but only has a little bit of railroad, or worse even, no railroad at all, that state's market access is going to suffer. And what this means is that the state is unable to bring and take goods from the market and is reliant on the local supply and demand. That means that your massive steel mills in your state are producing all of this steel, but there's not enough local buyers. So these steel mills are going to go bankrupt unless you can get the railroads in place to start transporting that steel to the people that actually want to buy it. Now, of course, we have talked a lot about the railroads in Victoria 3, but that is, for a reason, because railroads were massively important to the era. Before you invent railroads, you are largely constrained by nature's tyranny. If you have a big river, if you have good coastal access, if you have a country without tall mountains, all of these things will help you move goods around, but you will still be limited by the natural infrastructure potential of your country until you get railroads. Once you get railroads, all of that changes, and suddenly the only limit to how many goods you can move around is how much money you're willing to invest in laying track and providing engines to zoom across your country. When it comes to natural sources of infrastructure, we're talking about what's called state traits. What it means is that if you have a major river or the Great Lakes, or even something that isn't so good for your infrastructure, like the Siberian tundra, which makes it a lot more difficult to get around, this is represented in the form of a state trait. And state traits can have a variety of effects, but the most important effect is the effect on your infrastructure and the natural infrastructure that is available to you to start with.
Good infrastructure is important no matter what type of nation you're running. But so are POPs. And that leads us to employment and qualifications.
All POPs have a profession, which is what sort of employment the workforce part of that POP is engaged in. That also represents their social strata, like are they upper class or middle class or lower class, and generally their overall way of life and ideologies, interest group affiliations, things like that. The professions themselves, though, don't have any inherent attributes. They don't do anything particular. It's all up to the production methods in the buildings where they work, what they actually accomplish in their role. Simple laborers are people who work with their hands and can fill a number of roles in multiple buildings. On the other hand, aristocrats are strictly landowners. You will only find them in rural buildings where they will hold positions of ownership. So they will collect most of the profits. So as a player of Victoria 3, when you decide to switch on a new production method. You now need a more qualified type of worker who needs to know a little bit more than how to carry things from one place to another. You need to have the capacity to employ these people in order to get full throughput out of that production method. So every building employs a number of different professions. All of those professions are needed in order to get the work done. You can't just run a building on 50% on all laborers. You're going to need a proportional amount of all the different professions, and buildings will always try to achieve full employment. They will never attempt on purpose to stop at partial employment somewhere in the middle. A building that is not fully employed, seems to have a problem finding employees, will attempt to use their profits to raise the wages such that they can start hiring more people, attract them away from other buildings. As a player, if you decide to expand a building way beyond the capacity or the demand for the goods that the building produces, you are going to find that their profits aren't going to be enough to raise the wage to the point that they can hire all these new qualified employees. So it's in your interest not only to decide what sectors of your industry to grow, but also ensure that they are the profitable parts of your economy. Not every pop can turn into any other pop at will. If you have a bunch of peasants working on a subsistence farm, you might not be able to hire many of them as engineers in your brand new factory that you opened up. So for example, if you have a bunch of aristocrats that have been robbed of all their land and are now unemployed, it may be that some of them will want to take up employment as engineers. And on account of their higher wealth and literacy, they are more likely to develop qualifications to become engineers than the peasants on the subsistence farms. It's up to you as a player, if your strategy is to move in a certain direction where you have pops of certain professions that perform certain kinds of jobs and have certain political allegiances. If that is your goal, it's up to you to ensure that the qualifications in your country also match up with the professions that you're trying to create. There has to be an opening available for a pop to change into the profession that is required. Without that, pops will just remain in the profession that they are. Pop qualifications is a kind of background feature of Victoria 3. It is something that is a crucial part of the simulation to ensure that the right kind of pops turn into the kind of pops that you expect. But as a player, you might want to plan ahead. Once you know how this works, you might know that I'm setting off on an industrialization spree in about 10 years, and I'm gonna need a well-educated population for that, otherwise they won't be qualified to take on those jobs. When pops die or get promoted or move out of state, they take their qualifications with them. So if you suffer a mass migration on account of a terrible standard of living, it's very possible that your most qualified pops are going to leave the country, and suddenly you find yourself with a brain drain. And this is something that we've found during development is just a side effect of the system that is really fascinating and that we hope you will like too.
Keeping your national workforce employed and satisfied is going to be interesting indeed. But what about the money? Let's talk about your treasury.
In Victoria 3, money is not an accumulated resource. Well, it can be, but there are a lot of caveats involved. Money is looked upon in your nation as a weekly balance. It is the tallying of your revenues versus your expenses and looking at how did you do for this week. And this weekly balance can fluctuate. You don't build buildings by waiting to see if you have the money to do so and then plopping it down. Well, you can, but it's not always advised to do so. You can go into deficits, you can take loans, you can have your expenses outgrow your revenues. It's all a risk you have to take. When you have more income than you have expenses, you have a budget surplus. And in Victoria 3, when you have a surplus, your government, your institutions, they buy gold. That is the closest you come to stockpiling money for a rainy day fund, for a war you're planning, or for the expansion of your industry. Now, gold isn't traded on a one-to-one. It's not infinite. Everybody wants it. And so, of course, the more money you have, or the more gold you have, the less you're able to get from it. And so it has a sense of diminishing returns. Too much money can be a bad thing. When your expenses exceed your income, you have to make up for it. And by doing that, your government takes on a loan. It looks towards private and international vendors and goes, we need capital to make ends meet. We promise we'll pay you back. Now, taking a loan isn't a horrible idea. If that is to build more industry, to increase your revenues in some way, it can be a wise decision. But too many loans unpaid more importantly, and the rest of the world starts looking at you a little bit differently. And that can put you into bankruptcy. Now, when you're bankrupt, no one really wants to give you money. You've proven before you can't pay it back. And not only do other nations look at you strangely, but internally, the faith of your population is shaken. The government who has said that they're backing up this economic institution, that they're facilitating this trade with their currency, has proven that it can't be trusted. And your economy may grind to a halt because of it. Your people may get very upset. You get money in multiple ways. Across all nations, each government has a permanent little sense of income. It is their minting, their printing of currency, their species of gold, eventually, as we come to understand paper money and that backing. There will always be a minor amount of income at the very least. Less if it grows too large, you could have problems. A main way that everybody gains income is taxes. It's an absolute. Now, you can tax just about everything. You can make your taxes specific to your population. You can do it by income and make it where your pops pay a burden based on how much they actually earn. You can do a poll tax that's flat across the board. Sure, it should make your wealthier pops happy. It might upset your lower class pops. That's what you're willing to pay. You can gain income through consumption-based taxes. You can choose mark a basket of goods in your domestic market and say, I want to charge more for that. That is where the funds are going to come from. And that's within your government's authority to do so. But they all have repercussions. Every tax you choose, every bit of income you try and take will affect the happiness of your pumps, their ability to meet their needs, and they all have repercussions. Money is the engine to do just about everything in Victoria 3, but it also, gaining it has consequences across the board. We've talked about how you can gain money. We've talked about how too much money is a bad thing, about too little money is a bad thing, but what do you actually spend money on? Money is spent on the construction projects within your country. You're paying for your military. You have to feed them. You have to arm them. You need to make sure the soldiers are paid. You need to make sure your bureaucrats are paid, so your institutions run, so you can receive the benefits of such. And if that good, that resource you want to produce is in your national interest, well, depending on the makeup of your nation, you can subsidize it. And then it becomes an expense you're willing to take for the benefit of your country.
And that's it for this monthly update video, but we'll be back again next month with more. Until then, follow us on your social media platform of choice to stay up to date on all things Victoria.